Good morning. Today in the life of the church, we're in a new season. All sorts of things are different. We are now in the season of Lent, a season designed to help us engage more deeply with the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection, events that even now we celebrate weekly and acknowledge weekly as we come together to this table, but which we will profoundly engage in just a few weeks in Holy Week and as we approach Good Friday and Easter. Through these next few weeks, what we are going to be doing in the sermon is a little bit less life application and a little bit more in-depth understanding, hopefully anyway. It depends on the quality of the sermon, I guess. The idea is that we will be enriched in such a way that we can engage that material in Holy Week and Easter more readily. We'll be exploring over these coming weeks the covenants that God has made with humanity, or representatives of humanity in some cases, what was expected of us in these covenants, and what was expected of God, and how little we have gotten right along the way, even while God has gotten plenty of things right, or at least that is the estimation of the church. Now, covenant, for starters, and this is where we're going to start today, covenant is not language we use a whole lot out there in the world. And where once upon a time it might have been safe to assume that we all just remember Sunday school lessons and we know our church vocabulary, it's probably helpful for us to go back to some of these terms that we throw around a lot. Covenant is a critically important vocabulary word for Christians and for our Jewish siblings, but perhaps less so in the rest of our lives. Theologian and priest Sam Wells writes that the most important relationships in our lives are defined by covenants, and that these are important to distinguish from their counterpart, contracts. Now, I like his sentiment here a lot. I don't entirely agree with the way that he's written this, but I like the feeling it gives. Sam Wells is from England. I'm guessing they don't have HOAs in England, and so he doesn't have covenant restrictions in his neighborhood there in Trafalgar Square, but here we do. That might be the only purely secular place that we use the word covenant. Elsewhere, we reserve that term. When you think of covenant, my guess is many of you will quickly go straight to wedding vows and marriage covenants. If not there, it may be that you jumped to baptismal covenant. Probably somewhere in there is it's all sorts of language that we can use to talk about what these things mean. What is a covenant? Well, in a wedding, there are certain contractual obligations, agreements that the parties come to about what to do, signified by the vows. But the vows themselves signify something of the relationship that is intended by the marriage. The vows speak only to the basics. While it might be helpful, no one can use their wedding vows as a manual for how to interact with one another in a marriage. We could use a manual. It would be really helpful to have a manual. God, why didn't you give us a manual? But God did not give us a manual, and so instead what we have is an opportunity to engage with one another using our imagination and our goodwill to form a partnership shaped by the vows in marriage. There's something in there for us. Marriage isn't defined by performance and perfection, but instead by a lifelong partnership in which the parties bring their creativity and their goodwill. Baptism, similarly, there are obligations stated in our baptismal covenant. You can look those up on page 301 in your Book of Common Prayer if you'd like to. But what is intended is a relationship in which the parties come together in partnership with one another. Contractual obligations are just a starting point, and there is no manual for how to live a life of a baptized person. We sometimes think the Bible is our manual. It's not. What instead is asked of us is to bring our goodwill and our creativity to interact with God and with our sponsors and with our parents and with the congregation. And each one of those members of this covenant is expected to work together to lead a life of faithfulness. Performative perfection, not the thing. Lifelong partnership and faithfulness, now we're talking. We can have contracts between parties that have never met one another before. It would be impossible to do that with a covenant. Covenants require a level of intimacy to ensure that the partnerships are maintained even while performing imperfectly the obligations and actions stipulated by the agreement itself. So, I trust that you're on the same page with me now. We can go into the Bible. The Bible has a lot of covenants in all sorts of shapes and sizes and different forms. There are covenants between partners in marriage, absolutely. And there are covenants between kings of neighboring kingdoms who will talk about like who's going to give cedar trees to the other, who will give grain, who's got gold, all that kind of stuff. They are contracts. But they are contracts built around relationships. Relationships are assumed in the contract. And this will allow the Bible and the biblical authors to create a rich metaphor or analogy for understanding how God relates to humanity and humanity relates to God. What could be better than to describe this in terms of a series of covenants? And that's exactly what they will do. Many different covenants. We'll look at several of them as we march through Lent here a little bit. But today, we read through a section of the Bible in which God is forming God's first covenant with humanity, or a representative thereof, Noah, namely. We can talk about a proto-covenant preceding this one. That would be some kind of partnership that God had with Adam and Eve, the first humans in the garden. But that never uses the word covenant. This is the first place. Actually, I think it's a little bit earlier than here, but here in chapter 9, we can say, this is the first place where God is using the word covenant. Rather than lay out the terms of the agreement and how we got here, it might just be worth hearing kind of the outline of the story again. Since those first human beings, Adam and Eve, they were banished from the garden, if you will recall, because they violated that proto-covenant, humanity has been growing and spreading across the face of the globe. With humanity's growth, multiplying, some kind of fundamental flaw seems to be following us. Now, the Bible never names what this flaw is, which may come as a surprise to some of you, I know, but I promise it's true. The Bible never says what the flaw is. Instead, it just keeps pointing to the symptoms and the way that the symptoms of whatever disease this is keep on seeming to come forth. The Bible will begin eventually to refer to sin, and first the Bible will speak of sin as some kind of existential force, not a being, and not the flaw itself, but something that seems to bring out the symptoms of the flaw in the human character. At some point, God sees how the flaw is only multiplying and how sin is growing as it leverages this flaw. And God says, I'm going to have to start over here. I'm going to have to erase the existing picture and see what can be done with a new creation. There are fewer small kids here, so it's easier than it was at 9 o'clock to talk about an Etch-a-Sketch. God's going to shake the Etch-a-Sketch and make the picture new. Can you believe that kids don't know about Etch-a-Sketches these days? I couldn't come up with a Minecraft analogy. That's what I needed to do. Before God shakes the Etch-a-Sketch, God takes pity on Noah, one person in Noah's family, and decides that, okay, if I can get Noah and if I can get pairs of clean animals and we put them in an ark, I'll wipe the slate clean and then we'll restart with these folks. They will repopulate the freshly cleaned earth. When Noah and his family get off the ark, God makes a covenant with Noah. We saw that today. It's sometimes called the covenant of life. We saw today God's side of the bargain. Never again will I cut off all life on earth with the flood. We might have wished that God had just ended with, I will never again cut off all life from the earth. But God leaves himself some room. Depends on how things go, but I won't do it with water. We get the etiological story, the origin story of the rainbow, and that as a sign of the covenant, the promise, God's side of the bargain, that God will not destroy all life with a flood. But the covenant is not one-sided. Preceding this portion, Noah and humanity have their side of the covenant laid out for them. It's stated both in positive terms and in negative terms, what they should do, what they should not do. On the positive side, be fruitful and multiply, an echo of the command given to the first humans, Adam and Eve, in the garden. And in the negative sense, do not shed blood. There will be a reckoning for bloodshed, especially human bloodshed. It will be important for us to come back to that later, even in today's conversation, but especially as we go forward toward Holy Week. Noah and his sons will then leave the ark. The Bible does what's called telescoping. They take things that have to be pretty far apart and smash them together. On the day that Noah gets off the ark, somehow he also plants a vineyard, raises some grapes all the way to maturity, takes those grapes and smashes them and ferments them and gets a glass of wine out of the deal. It takes a little while, but it all happens in the span of one period here in Genesis. And Noah gets drunk and goes to sleep naked in his tent. Strikes us perhaps as scandalous. The Bible kind of treats it as scandalous, but it's not really that big of a deal. He hasn't violated the covenant. So why is it such a scandal? In some sense, it may be that the author wanted us to hear this kind of dun, dun, dun. What's happening? If this were Law and Order SVU, you'd hear that kind of bum, bum. A heartbeat that says a crime has happened. Something is wrong. We're 6 chapters to 9 chapters further in the book, but not much has changed. When we last left Adam and Eve, violating the first covenant or the proto-covenant, the eyes of both of them were opened and they realized that they were naked. Here is Noah, right back in the same state that Adam and Eve were in, as if humanity hasn't really changed at all. It's a deliberate echo again of the first story as we move into the next story. Will humanity violate their end of the bargain? The author seems to be suggesting, yeah, you know how Law and Order goes. You've seen this story before. Of course they will. As the story will progress, not only will there be issues related to being fruitful and multiplying, but even more so, there will be bloodshed, and quite a lot of it, as anyone who has read the Old Testament would say. Humanity's capacity for wanton violence and destruction will only multiply as humanity multiplies, and we have plenty of evidence to the fact today. We know it hasn't stopped. But even here at the beginning with this covenant and humanity's assured violation of this covenant, the authors are also trying to point to something else so critically important. And that is that God will stay faithful to God's side of the bargain. Never again will I destroy all of humanity and creation because of this flaw that is still with you. God, when God makes a covenant, will keep God's side, and so God will respond, finding some other way to bring about the essential goodness that God had intended as God's purpose for creation. God creates humanity in God's image. Humanity has once again distorted and hidden that image. So God will have to find another way. Now, the next way that God will choose is the story of Abraham. And we'll turn to that next week as we come back together again. And time again, we will have to come to new covenants because God will continue to have to respond to us failing to hold up our end of the bargain. But between now and then, there is something for us to do, not just wait to learn a little bit more, but to be thankful that even here in this first covenant, we are pointed to the character of God who never gives up on us. Between now and then, let us be thankful that God remembers us, as the psalm we heard today says, not according to our performative perfection. Not according to our performative perfection, but according to the relationship that God has established with us, according to God's love, and for the sake of God's essential goodness. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.